In the history of naval warfare, few battles mark such a brutal, decisive turning point as Tsushima. It wasn't just a battle. It was a reckoning. A complete annihilation. As one observer at the time put it, it was by far the greatest and the most important naval event since Trafalgar. This is the story of a desperate 18,000-mile voyage, a clash between old and new technology, and a brilliant, ruthless commander. His strategy wouldn't just seal the fate of a war, but would redraw the map of global power for the 20th century. In less than 24 hours, an entire fleet, the pride of a vast empire, was systematically erased from existence. This is the naval clash that changed history. Our story really begins months before the first shot was fired, half a world away from the Korea Strait. At the dawn of the 20th century, two empires were on a collision course over Manchuria and Korea. Imperial Russia, ancient and sprawling, and the Empire of Japan, young and fiercely ambitious. Diplomacy had failed. On the night of February 8, 1904, without a formal declaration of war, Admiral Tōgō's Heihachirō Japanese combined fleet launched a surprise torpedo attack on the Russian squadron at Port Arthur, bottling them up and starting a crippling blockade. For Tsar Nicholas II, this was an intolerable insult. Back in St. Petersburg, a desperate plan was hatched. They would dispatch the Baltic fleet on an unprecedented 18,000 nautical mile journey to the Far East. This armada, renamed the Second Pacific Squadron and commanded by Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky, was ordered to break the blockade, crush the upstart Japanese, and restore Russian dominance. It was a grand, almost mythical undertaking. It was also doomed from the very start. The fleet was a motley collection of ships. It had some powerful new battleships, but they were lumped in with outdated coastal defense ships and old cruisers. It was a fleet of wildly different capabilities that had barely ever sailed together. The 7-month voyage became a modern odyssey of suffering. An early, disastrous incident in the North Sea set the tone. Shrouded in fog and paranoia, the Russian gunners mistook British fishing trawlers for Japanese torpedo boats and opened fire, killing innocent fishermen and nearly dragging Great Britain into the war. As they steamed south, things only got worse. In the tropical heat, marine life fouled the hulls, dramatically slowing the ships. They were dangerously overloaded with coal, piled high on the decks, which pushed their armor belts below the waterline and made them unstable. By the time they reached the East China Sea, the crews were exhausted, sick, and near mutiny. And to top it all off, their primary mission had vanished. While they were still at sea, Port Arthur had fallen to the Japanese. The squadron they were sent to relieve was gone. Their only hope now was to limp to the last remaining Russian port in the region, Vladivostok. Meanwhile, the Japanese fleet, under the command of the brilliant and disciplined Admiral Togo, was waiting. Togo's fleet had returned to its home bases to refit, repair, and train with a ferocious intensity. His men were well rested, their morale was high, and their gunnery skills were honed through relentless drills. But Japan's most critical advantage was technological. Their ships, many built in British yards, were newer, faster, and more standardized, making fleet maneuvers far simpler. They had superior rangefinders, effective up to around 10,000 meters, while the Russians were limited to about 4,000 to 5,000 meters. Their shells were filled with a potent high explosive called Shermo's powder, designed to shred the upperworks of enemy ships and start fires. Most importantly, the Japanese had mastered wireless telegraphy, the radio. This gave Togo a revolutionary tool for command and control, allowing his scouts to feed him constant intelligence on the Russian fleet's position. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place based on Togo's unshakable conviction. He gambled that the Russians, low on coal and time, would be forced to take the shortest route to Vladivostok, through the narrow Tsushima Strait. He was right. Admiral Rozhestvensky, seeing no other option, steered his fleet directly into the trap Togo had laid. The stage was set for one of the most one-sided confrontations in military history. At dawn on May 27, 1905, the fog over the Korea Strait began to clear. A Japanese scout cruiser sent the message Togo had been waiting for: enemy ships sighted. As his fleet steamed out to intercept, Togo transmitted a now legendary message to all of Japan. The empire's fate depends on the result of this battle, Let every man do his utmost duty. He then hoisted the Z flag on his flagship Mikasa, a signal that would become immortalized in Japanese history. Around 1:40 in the afternoon, the two fleets finally saw each other. The Russians were lumbering north in two messy columns, a formation that limited their ability to fire. The Japanese approached from the northeast, holding a critical speed advantage of several knots, which made escape for the Russians impossible. What happened next was a moment of supreme risk and tactical brilliance. Instead of engaging in a parallel line, Togo executed a daring U-turn directly in front of the advancing Russians. It was the legendary crossing the T. It was also an incredibly dangerous move. As each Japanese ship made its turn, it was exposed to the concentrated fire of the lead Russian vessels. For a few minutes, Russian gunnery was effective. Togo's flagship Mikasa was struck over 15 times. But the gamble paid off spectacularly. Once the turn was complete, Togo's fleet was positioned across the path of the Russian columns. The Japanese could now fire devastating broadsides from all their main guns, raking the Russian ships from bow to stern. The Russians, in contrast, could only reply with their few forward-facing cannons. It was a slaughter. The technological superiority of the Japanese became terrifyingly apparent. Their centralized fire control allowed them to concentrate the fire of an entire ship on a single target. The Shermo's high-explosive shells tore apart the superstructures of the Russian battleships, starting massive, uncontrollable fires and wreaking havoc on the crews. The Russian flagship, Naya Suvorov, was battered relentlessly. Admiral Rozhestvinsky himself was severely wounded, and command of the Russian fleet completely fell apart. By sunset, the Russian formation was shattered. Four of their newest battleships, Naya Suvorov, Imperator Alexander III, Borodino, and Osliabia, were at the bottom of the sea. The survivors were scattered and terrified. But their ordeal wasn't over. As darkness fell, Togo unleashed his destroyers and torpedo boats to hunt down the crippled remnants. In the chaos, some Russian ships made a fatal error. They switched on their searchlights to find the attackers, but only succeeded in illuminating themselves, becoming perfect targets. The night was filled with explosions as the battleship Navran was torpedoed and sunk, while the cruiser Sisoi Veliki was heavily damaged by torpedoes and scuttled the next morning. It was a night of absolute carnage. The Japanese lost only 3 torpedo boats. The dawn of May 28th revealed a scene of utter devastation. The remnants of the Russian fleet, now under Rear Admiral Nikolai Nebagatov, were spotted trying to escape. Togo's battleships, still fresh, easily surrounded them. For Admiral Nebagatov, the moment of truth had arrived. His ships were hopelessly outmatched. To continue the fight would mean the pointless slaughter of his men. At 10:53 a.m., he ordered the ensign of the Imperial Russian Navy to be lowered. The battle was over. The final toll was almost unbelievable. Of the 38 Russian ships that entered the strait, a staggering 21 were sunk, 7 were captured, and many others were scuttled or interned in neutral ports. 5,045 Russian sailors were killed, and 6,016 were taken prisoner. In stark contrast, Japan had lost only 3 small torpedo boats and suffered just 117 killed. The Russian Baltic fleet had ceased to exist. The news from Tsushima sent shockwaves around the globe. The annihilation of its fleet forced a humiliated Russia to sue for peace. The resulting Treaty of Portsmouth, mediated by U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, was a landmark moment where Russia was forced to recognize Japan's new dominance in East Asia. For his role, Roosevelt would be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. But the consequences ran far deeper. For the first time in the modern era, a non-European nation had decisively defeated a major European power. The old assumptions of Western military supremacy were shattered overnight. Japan's victory announced its arrival as a world power and ignited a fire of imperial ambition that would define its history for the next 40 years. Within Russia, the defeat was an unmitigated disaster that helped light the fuse of revolution. The Russian people blamed the Tsar for the catastrophe, fueling the mass demonstrations and mutinies that defined 1905, including the famous uprising on the battleship Potemkin. Many historians now see the humiliation at Tsushima as a key factor that eroded the legitimacy of the Tsarist regime, directly contributing to the unrest that would explode into the Russian Revolution of 1917. Yet, the legacy of Tsushima held a dark and ironic twist for the victor. For Japan's military leaders, the overwhelming success became a dangerous obsession. The Navy became fixated on the doctrine of Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle, believing any future war could be won simply by replicating Togo's masterpiece. This stunning victory created a rigid and flawed playbook that Japan would carry into World War II. Japanese naval planners became convinced they could defeat the numerically superior United States Navy by luring it into a single, decisive engagement, where superior Japanese spirit would prevail, just as it had in 1905. This doctrine, born from triumph, blinded them to the new realities of naval warfare, especially the rise of the aircraft carrier. This obsession led directly to catastrophic failures at Midway and the Philippine Sea, as Japanese commanders desperately sought a new Tsushima in battles they could never win. In trying to repeat their greatest victory, they orchestrated their ultimate defeat. The Battle of Tsushima was far more than a naval engagement. It was a fulcrum of history that toppled one empire, created another, and planted the seeds of future conflicts. It's a powerful lesson that victory can be as blinding as defeat, and the strategies that win one war can lead to disaster in the next. Admiral Togo's flagship, the Mikasa, is now preserved as a museum ship in Japan, a silent testament to a day when the fate of nations was decided by steel, speed, and cannon fire. If you found this piece of naval history compelling, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more deep dives into the battles that shaped our world. Let us know in the comments which historical clash you'd like to see us cover next. Thank you for watching.